Hi everyone, in today's tutorial we're going to be painting the Grand Canal in Venice, and this is based off a copyright-free reference image that I found online, which will be linked in the description below. The full real-time tutorial is available on my Patreon page. This is a condensed version for YouTube, so if you prefer to paint along with me in real time where I'm talking live as I'm painting, then head over to my Patreon page. So let's jump into the tutorials and I'll go over my materials first. So the paper I'm using is 300 GSM cold pressed watercolor paper that's just been taped down with some masking tape. You'll see that with the reference image online there are some grid lines laid over the top, and that's just to help us with the drawing, and I'll go over that a little bit more later. The mixing tray is just a porcelain tray, and I'm going to be using a limited palette of colors today. For brushes, I've picked out a few. I'm mainly just going to be using a flat brush and angle brush and maybe a round brush for a couple of smaller details, and these are all synthetic brushes. I have a spray bottle for misting my paints, and then the colors here, I've got two blues. One is a primary cyan, which is more of a green blue, and the other is ultramarine blue, which is more of a purpley blue. Then I have alizarin crimson as my red. For my yellow, it's a Nika poster color in chrome yellow, but any kind of primary yellow, lemon yellow would work well. I just have some Nika poster colors from a couple of years ago that I'm still trying to use up. And then for the white, it's just titanium white. For the drawing, I've put up some grid lines both on the reference image and on my painting, and I think it just helps a lot with getting your proportions correct, and it just narrows down the margin of error. It's especially useful for scenes where there is architecture and buildings and things where you really have to get the perspective to look more accurate. So I'm using these grid lines to help me, and once I'm done with the drawing I will erase out the grid lines that I don't need. And then I also like to go over my drawing with my kneadable eraser. I just roll over it and it helps to lighten the lines a little bit, so it's kind of like ghosting the lines so that they're still there and I can see them, but they're a lot more faint so they don't peek through in the end if my gouache doesn't cover it. Now to start with this, I am going to paint in the shadows on the buildings, and it's important to me that I started with a strong drawing so that when I start painting I can just focus more on mixing my colors and placing them in the correct spot as opposed to trying to figure out the drawing as I'm painting. So for the color of the shadow, I'm going quite reddish blue, and with the limited palette I'm mostly going to be using the yellow, alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. I have the primary cyan mainly for the greenish color in the water and also some of the more greenish tones in the sky. And with the limited palette, it really forces you to think about how to color mix and color relationships as opposed to trying to match the color. So for the shadow of the buildings I mixed up some ultramarine, alizarin, a little bit of yellow and white, and I'm just blocking it in one shape, and I'm not trying to vary the color too much, keeping it one value so it holds together. And it really helps if you squint down at the reference image and you can just see that whole shadow shape as one shape. Then for the water, I'm going to block it in as well, and I blocked it in mostly with some primary cyan with a little bit of yellow, a little bit of ultramarine, and I just, again, I'm trying to block in the large shape. So my goal when I start this painting is to block in all of the white of the paper and try to be really accurate with my values and my shapes. And then in the second round I can come back and break things down to smaller shapes and make adjustments. I did go over my shadow color for the buildings a little bit and toned down the warmth. I think I started off a little bit too red, so I just cooled it down a little bit. Next, I'm going to paint in the sky, and for the sky, I just mixed some primary cyan and ultramarine blue with white, and I'm starting at the top and blocking it in. And as I move down, I'm going to add more white, and then as we get closer to the horizon, it gets a little bit pinkish, so I add in a little bit of alizarin crimson. I try to keep the paint nice and creamy so it's easy to blend. And I'm just adding more white as I go down, and then because I've got my drawing in already, it makes it easier for me to just paint around my drawing. At this stage, I'm just thinking of the large shapes of color, trying not to think of things like buildings and different things. If you squint down at the reference image, you'll see these large shapes of color, and that's what I'm trying to lay down at this stage. Now I'm going into the background and just laying down some of the shapes back there. So again, I'm just judging color and value relationships. So right now the relationship is the sky is lighter than the value of the water, which is lighter than the value of the shadow side of the buildings. And now I'm going into some of the light shapes on the buildings. And again, just trying to think about shapes. If you shrink the image down really small, or if you squint at it, it eliminates the details and you're just seeing the larger average shape. And that's what I'm putting in there. So for the light shapes, the value has to be lighter than the shadow. And I've mixed in just some alizarin crimson, yellow and white, and I've just blocked in those shapes of light on the building. Now mixing up a little bit of alizarin crimson with yellow and just painting on some of the really bright colored roofs. And if I want it to be a little bit of a darker value, I'll add a little bit of ultramarine blue into it, and just trying to mimic the shape that I'm seeing in the reference image. Here I'm allowing myself to warm up some of the buildings in shadow and start to differentiate them a little bit. So at first they were all just one average value and color, but now that I can see it's holding together well, I can allow myself to put in a little bit of variety, but not shifting the value so dramatically that it looks like it's in the light. I'm using a 3/8 inch angle brush, and I find angle brushes to be one of the most versatile brushes. You can get really thin lines, but you can also cover a good amount of space as well, and you can just get into those smaller shapes. So for most of the painting, I'm using an angle brush. Now I'm mixing a little bit of primary cyan with yellow and a little bit of alizarin crimson. I'm just painting that tree that you can see behind the building, painting in the shadow side, and then painting in the light side after. So the light side has a little bit more yellow in it and is a little bit warmer. And then I'll clean my palette quite often because this palette is quite small. Usually I paint on a larger palette, so I don't have to clean it so often, but for the sake of demonstration and being able to fit everything within the frame of the camera, I use a small palette and I just clean it frequently so I can mix up fresh color. And I'm painting on the shadow side of the dome on the salute, and the shadow on the dome is a kind of grayish blue. Then on the building itself, it's more of a purpley kind of color. It's a little bit less blue. And to see the color, I try and compare with surrounding things and just ask myself which one looks a little bit more blue or red, or how does one color relate to the other. And once I get in all the shadow shapes, then I'll go in and fill in the shapes of light, and then magically the building will start to appear and the shadow shapes will start to make sense. And I'm using a round brush now just so I can get into some of the finer shapes and details. And for the light side, I'm just mixing up ultramarine blue with white. To paint the roundness of the dome as it turns towards the light, it gets lighter and lighter. There's a lot of little details on these buildings, and I'm not going to be painting all of them. I really just want to paint a suggestion of what I see, so I am going to be ignoring or simplifying a lot of the little details. What I'm most concerned with is just painting in the shapes of light and the shapes of shadow and making sure that they make sense. And with the building in the very far back, I had painted in the shape of shadow, and now I'm just painting in the shape of the light, which once you paint it in, it gives context to that shape of shadow and starts to make sense. Now I'm going to cover the light on the building on the left, and I just mixed white with some yellow and a touch of red, and I'm just going to mass in that as one large shape, and then paint a little bit of the variety in the color so it gets a little bit more warm as it turns away. It's the local color of the building, I think it's just a little bit more pink. Then I'm also painting in the roof, which is a nice warm pinkish red. And with all the windows on this building, I'm going to have to find a way to paint it without actually having to paint all of them in, and I'll just be suggesting them. And then with all the boats and the docks in front of it, again, I would just be suggesting it in. So if you just squint down and paint what you see when you squint, you'll be able to simplify a complicated scene and have a way to tackle it in a painting. So here come the windows on the building, and I am just trying to tackle it with some loose abstract shapes. Right now the edges are very hard, which makes it feel a little bit pasted on, and you'll see later I'll come in with a clean brush and just soften it out. Then I just suggest a couple of other little things like the flags hanging out from the windows, and leave out a lot of the details and just make suggestions. So the windows I painted were a little bit wonky, so I just tried to straighten some of them out. But here, now I'm using a clean brush. You can see I'm just dipping it in the dirty water, and I'm essentially just brushing over what I just painted, and it just smudges things and it softens the edges and makes it feel more kind of impressionistic and less rigid. Now I've cleaned my palette again for some fresh mixing space, and I'm going to just darken some of the shadow underneath the building. So I mixed in some blue with both the blues, ultramarine and cyan, with some white, some yellow, some red, and there's just a little bit more of a heavier shadow just where the building is meeting the water. Then there's also a little bit of kind of like a stain on the buildings, the base of the building, where the water level sometimes goes up and down. So I'm going to add some of that to help connect the building with the water, so it doesn't look like one is just awkwardly meeting the other. So I just mixed a little bit of red, yellow and blue together, and I'm just brushing that on. Now I'm mixing some white with primary cyan and yellow, and I am just improving on the shapes a bit while adding a little bit of texture to the water. So there's always ripples in the water. It's not perfectly still, so by adding on some of that, it makes the water feel less flat and a little bit more dimensional. There's also a boat on the right hand side, which I'm just going to loosely suggest as a couple of shapes. It's just to add something into the water, because obviously there are boats in the water and it wouldn't be completely empty. Now for the things on the left hand side, again, just really suggesting them as impressionistic shapes, so mixing up some white with some of the reds and yellows, and just painting in some of the details I can see. When I really squint down, I just pick out a couple of things and suggest them. Now I'm ready to start painting some windows on the buildings, and I'm just mixing a little bit of yellow with blue and red and a bit of white, and I'm just going to suggest the shape of them, and I'm not going to paint every window, just some of the main ones. And for the windows in the shadow, I have to darken that value, so I add a little bit more blue to it. So things in the shadow are darker in value, things in the light are lighter, and I always have to maintain that relationship between light and shadow to make it look convincing. And I leave windows as something that I do towards the end when I'm sure that, or when I'm more certain that everything else is in the right place, or I'm happy with the values and the colors that I have before placing in little details. So hopefully you notice that this process was a process of painting from general to specific, so starting with the large general shapes and then breaking them down into smaller shapes and getting more specific as I go along, and as I'm more sure about the values and shapes that I've laid down. For the buildings that are in shadow, I barely suggest anything. It's really important that I keep the values really compressed, meaning that nothing is jumping out of the shadows, because when you squint down, nothing is jumping out. It's all very much compressed into one value, and so I try to keep that as well. Otherwise the painting will start to jump. You want the jump to be between your light and your shadow, and not within the shadow itself. So keeping that really compressed and just barely suggesting some windows there. Now at the tail end of the painting, I'm just painting on a couple more boats and just little details here and there to finish off the painting. So I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial, and again, the full real-time version, which is about 2 hours long, is over on Patreon, and I've got over 100 tutorials there, so feel free to have a look if you're interested in painting along with me in real time. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.